Welcome to the Cycle of Care podcast. I'm your host, Mona Zignego, and I'm super excited you're here. Today, we're going to look at the cycle of care and bias. We're going to engage in a bias reflection activity, and last of all, we are going to talk about this week's Cycle of Care superhero. I want to start today's content by just briefly revisiting the definition of the cycle of care. So, the cycle of care consists of the invisible reciprocal giving and receiving of energy that happens between people. The cycle of care can occur between two people or within a group. We know from research that when care is present, relationships thrive, folks feel a greater sense of belonging, and the reciprocal giving and receiving of care supports growth for those involved. Now, I saw care in action since my last podcast in some really meaningful ways. For example, I was at an event and someone I hadn't seen in a long time asked me how I was doing and what I was working on these days. As I answered the question, the person looked me in the eye, leaned toward me asking questions that showed they were listening, and they nodded their head ever so often, as in affirmation that what I was saying was actually meaningful to them. This conversation was powerful, and it meant a lot to me that this person cared enough to ask me the question, "What are you working on these days?" This is what the cycle of care looks like when care is being facilitated between two people. A disruption in the cycle of care could look like, as I was answering the question, maybe the person started arguing with me or swearing at me or just walked away angrily. So we need to come together to solve problems, find solutions, and help one another. Understanding the cycle of care energy has the potential to show us where care is disrupted and where care is being facilitated. We care about this because understanding where care is facilitated or disrupted can support us in moving forward in solution-oriented ways with greater understanding and awareness of ourselves and those around us. And I'll give you some examples today of just how that has happened for me. My hope is that by sharing my experiences, research, and content on care, we can all commit to care. By this, I mean commit to understanding ourselves and those around us, and subsequently spreading care throughout our world. I want to mention one other thing before we talk about biases. In my research, I have found that just defining the cycle of care in a general way as the reciprocal giving and receiving of energy that happens between people felt kind of vague and not as actionable as I would like. I didn't want to talk about care abstractly. I wanted to understand the finite elements involved so that I could operationalize care and work through the disruptions I was experiencing. So here's what I did. I conducted an analysis of the literature on care from a number of sources, but mostly from the philosopher Nell Noddings. And I identified specific elements within the cycle of care of relationships, listening, thinking, and responding. In future episodes, I'm going to dig into these four elements of the cycle of care of relationships, listening, thinking, and responding. Today, though, I'm just going to stick with this more general definition of care as the reciprocal giving and receiving of energy that happens between people. All right, let's dig into some information on biases and care. All right, so let's take a trip back in time to the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm sure you're all thinking, great, Mona, super fun time. Thanks for the memory. All right, I get it, but just stay with me for a minute, all right? At the beginning of the pandemic, when the world got shut down and everything for me and my work went virtual, I panicked. I had been teaching for decades at that point, and everything I did hinged on face-to-face interaction, especially feedback. So let me give you some context. During the pandemic, I was a literacy consultant full-time, and I was a part-time university professor. All of my teaching materials were in an in-person format only and had to be completely reworked to be available for online teaching and presentations. It was honestly a really overwhelming amount of work. But what seemed to really break me during that time wasn't actually the work of adapting my materials and content to a virtual friendly format, but rather my inability in the virtual setting to get feedback from those with whom I was working. Let me get more specific. Pre-pandemic, whether I was teaching teachers, kindergarten through 12th grade children, or university students, I prided myself on my ability to read the room. I had told myself that I noticed everyone I was working with and could tell that learning was happening just by looking at people's facial expressions, hearing their answers to my questions, and noting body language. I felt like the data I was collecting through this audio-visual feedback told me what I needed to know. Hey, we were all learning and growing together. Emphasis on the word all. And this exemplifies two of the three biases I want to talk about today: optimism bias and reliance on partial information bias. Optimism bias can be defined as an ignoring of any negative data because we want to believe that things are going well. So we only pay attention to positive information that's coming in. Reliance on partial information bias means we are forming conclusions without all the current facts. I definitely wanted to believe that everyone I worked with were doing well and that all our hard work was paying off. And I'm going to be completely vulnerable with you all and tell you that I definitely looked for data to support that everyone was doing well and thriving, more so than any data that told me otherwise. But when we went virtual, I couldn't see or hear that positive data that I thrived on in the same way at all. The virtual setting changed everything. Now that everything was online, I could not see, hear, and collect feedback in the same way as pre-pandemic. I'm going to be honest with you. I felt lost, incompetent, cut off. I questioned my ability to teach, and I thought seriously about leaving the teaching profession. I felt a lack of purpose, connection, and belonging. And after deeply researching my teaching practice, I realized a lack of care. I no longer felt that giving and receiving of energy that happens between people in this new and unfamiliar virtual setting. But this actually turned out to be a good thing because I realized that I was guilty of a few things. First, as I mentioned already, I had optimism and reliance on partial information bias. I was constantly looking for proof that everyone was learning, and I did not look at all the information available to me to come to that conclusion. But when we went to the virtual setting, as I worked with kids and adults, I found through the chat feature that when people were able to message just me without the rest of the group seeing the message, people shared questions and voiced misunderstandings that they never would have in the regular face-to-face environment. This was exciting to me. For the first time, I realized I'd been guilty of bias. This was powerful learning for me, and I realized I needed to become a bias detective. What other kinds of bias are there? I wondered. I began to research different types of biases so that I could recognize them wherever they appeared in my life, hopefully. When it comes to care, we are interested in learning about bias because bias gets in the way of care. Bias clouds the truth, and awareness of our biases helps us to be more objective and see things as they truly are, rather than what we want or expect things to be. None of us are perfect, and we are all a work in progress. In fact, Ernest Hemingway said, "The world breaks everyone, and afterward, many are strong at the broken places." Let me say that again. The world breaks everyone, and afterward, many are strong at the broken places. I think about this quote often. I have broken places. I have imperfections, and I want to build those broken places up and then share those places with the world. Today, I'm doing that by talking honestly and vulnerably about my biases. There are a variety of biases that can manifest for us, and I talk about them in detail in my book, Transforming Teaching Through the Cycle of Care. But for our purposes here, the other bias I want to mention today is pessimism bias. To make this easier to remember, let's use the acronym POR, or POR. This stands for pessimism bias, optimism bias, and reliance on partial information bias, POR. Pessimism bias happens when we have an exaggerated focus on negativity and adversity. It is the tendency to overestimate the likelihood of negative outcomes, or assume the worst will happen, even when there's little to no evidence to support it. I showed this kind of bias when I couldn't see anything good in teaching online. All I saw were the deficits and struggles. It wasn't until my students began to message me privately and I was able to help and support them that I realized there actually were some really good things happening in our virtual setting. Another example could be if you were preparing for a big job interview for a job you are qualified for, and you have spent weeks practicing common interview questions, researching the company, and refining your resume. And despite all the preparation, you truly believe you won't get the job. You don't look at your strengths, you don't look at your assets, you just go pessimistic. That's pessimism bias. Optimism bias arises when we ignore data because we have a desire to believe that only good things will happen or are happening. So this can look like overestimating positive outcomes. So one example could be thinking it won't happen to me when facing potential negative outcomes like illness or financial hardship. Or like not checking the weather before a camping trip because why would I need to check the weather? It's always nice this time of year. That type of thing is optimism bias. And then, last but not least, reliance on partial information bias uses past knowledge and experience to form conclusions without having all the facts. For example, a friend assumes another is upset with them because of the tone they interpret from a text without considering other factors. Other factors could be maybe the person was just busy or distracted. I see this type of bias a lot in myself and others. Folks assume something without all the facts to support it. This pandemic experience allowed me the unique window into seeing my biases and offered me an opportunity to address them within the context of care. All right, it's time for our activity for this episode. Let's begin our poor bias detective activity. This activity is supposed to help us reflect on poor. Poor, again, is pessimism bias, optimism bias, and our reliance on partial information bias. This activity allows us to explore how these biases affect our decisions, our interactions with people, and outcomes as a result of our actions. So essentially, we're looking to become more metacognitive. In the context of this specific podcast, metacognition refers to the ability to think about and reflect on our own thinking and notice when biases are present. Metacognition involves being aware of how our biases, such as pessimism bias, optimism bias, and reliance on partial information bias, influence our perceptions, judgments, actions, and our decisions that we're making. So here are the poor biases again. Pessimism bias is overestimating negative outcomes or assuming the worst will happen even without sufficient evidence. Optimism bias is overestimating positive outcomes and underestimating risks. Reliance on partial information bias is drawing conclusions based on incomplete or limited information. So the activity is we ask ourselves, am I being overly pessimistic? Am I being overly optimistic? Do I have all the information I need? So the questions we can ask ourselves are, am I being overly pessimistic? Am I being overly optimistic? Do I have all the information that I need? Here's our takeaway challenge. As we near the end of our activity for this episode, I really want to create a safe space for being human, acknowledging our imperfections, and striving to do better each day. So, over the next week, ask yourself these 3 poor questions. Am I being overly pessimistic? Am I being overly optimistic? Do I have all the information I need to catch yourself when you experience pessimism bias, optimism bias, or reliance on partial information bias? You could also consider writing this down. Sometimes that can help to think about the situation, the bias, and how you addressed it. Reflecting on biases are important for a variety of reasons. For one thing, reflecting on our biases helps improve our decision-making processes. Biases can cloud judgment. So becoming more metacognitive about where our biases are impeding our judgment can help us make decisions that are more informed, balanced, and based on evidence. Reflecting on biases can also strengthen our relationships. When we are able to reflect critically on ourselves, it can lead to our becoming more caring, empathetic, understanding, and It supports resolving conflict or restoring what's been broken. Additionally, it can support us in becoming more resilient and adaptive, like you saw with me during the pandemic. The cycle of care includes an awareness of our biases. If we aren't aware of our biases, we risk thinking the cycle of care is disrupted when it actually is not. We all have biases. We can't get away from that. Remember the Hemingway quote from earlier? The world breaks everyone, and afterward, many are strong at the broken places. One way I have strengthened myself in my broken places is by acknowledging my biases and reflecting on them. I would love it if you would join me so that we can live our best life, spreading care out into the world. And that is a great segue for our Cycle of Care superhero. This episode's superhero was one of my professors from college. Research has shown that we don't really remember many of our university professors. But I sure remember this professor. He was really memorable. For one thing, his office was unlike any I had ever seen. There were teddy bears everywhere. Teddy bears lined all the shelves, were stacked up the walls, and were perched on his windowsill and any available space on his desk. Additionally, this professor had an interesting way of grading that I had never been exposed to before. He told us that we had to come up with how we wanted to be assessed. We had all the options in the world, he told us. We could have unit assessments, write a paper, do a presentation, whatever we wanted. We just had to talk with him about it and get it approved. For the record, I ended up doing a paper at the end of the semester that summarized all the chapters in our course book. And in case you're wondering, my memory is that I got an A, but I should probably get back on track. This professor used class time in a really unique way. Every day he came into the classroom, pulled up a chair, looked expectantly at us, and asked, "What do you want to talk about today?" He then waited, his caring personality encircling the room like a warm hug from one of the teddy bears in his office. What you might expect is that one of us would ask something from one of the chapters in the book, maybe looking for clarity or seeking some understanding of an abstract concept. But that is not what happened. What people did was share. They shared stories about their lives, their struggles, their successes, their ups, downs, and whatever was on their minds. It was unlike any class I have ever attended before or since. There is one day that stands out to me in particular. On this day, spring was emerging, the sun shone brightly, melting snow, pushing blossoms from crabapple trees, and nurturing our campus with a warm spring glow-up. My mind was filled with thoughts of barbecues and other fun activities outside with friends, filling my social calendar as I walked to class on this day. As usual, our professor came into our small class of about 12 people, pulled up a chair, and asked, "What do you want to talk about today?" He then leaned back in his chair and just waited. No one spoke up for a bit. Everyone just sat in sort of a companionable silence, reflecting for a few minutes, waiting to see who would speak first on this day. And then one woman spoke up. Throughout this semester, this woman had been very quiet. My memory is that she had not spoken all semester or even really made eye contact with anyone in the class. Unlike the rest of us, she hadn't seemed interested in connecting with anyone in the class or making friends. The words she spoke that day have stayed with me my whole life. She said that her husband was in the military and had been deployed that morning. She shared she was really struggling and wasn't sure how to cope with the situation. She poured out her heart that day to us. And as she told her story, our professor exemplified the 4 elements in the cycle of care model of relationships, listening, thinking, and responding. He had already created such a deep and trusting relationship with our class that she felt safe sharing this deep sadness she was holding. He listened to her fully and completely as she talked. He leaned forward in his chair, had eye contact with her the whole time, nodded his head as she talked, and gave her the space and time she needed as he fully, completely, and compassionately listened. I remember being stunned by this situation. Looking at this woman, I never would have thought she was carrying such a heavy burden. I remember that moment so vividly because forever after that, I have reminded myself that we cannot always know what burdens people are carrying on the inside by looking at them from the outside. This was powerful learning for me. In this conversation, and all the others that took place before this, my professor was thoughtful in his responses and never made anything about him. It was always about us, about our learning, about our struggles, our joys, our sorrows, who we were, where we were going, and how we were going to get there. He cared about us. And I still remember him and the experiences he gave us in his class all these years later, when memories of other professors have faded like wisps of smoke blowing away in the wind. The memory of the teddy bear professor, as I affectionately call him, lives on strongly in my mind forever. He really cared about us, and I will never forget him and the kindness he showed in everything he did and said. The teddy bear professor didn't just teach us content. He taught us how to care and be cared for, modeling the cycle of care in every interaction. His office, filled with teddy bears, was more than just a quirky decoration. It physically manifested his warmth and approachability. His grading methods were a lesson in trust and his belief in us. His classroom conversations were examples of listening, empathy, and shared humanity. The teddy bear professor showed us that learning is not just about absorbing facts and acing tests. It's about connecting with others, listening, understanding, and fostering environments where people feel cared for. Decades later, I still carry these lessons he imparted, not just into my work, but in how I strive every day to interact with the world. He was more than just a professor. He was a guide, a listener, and a giver of care. And so, this episode's Cycle of Care superhero, the teddy bear professor, is someone whose legacy continues to inspire me, and I really hope through this story inspires you too. May we all become bias detectives and grow stronger in all our broken places. Until next time, I'm Mona Zignego, and this is the Cycle of Care podcast.